Good afternoon. Happy Thursday to everyone. Welcome into the place. We're very glad to have all of you join us today. Um, this is a good day. This is a good day because I'm really excited to be here with the guests I'm going to introduce you in a moment and to have this conversation. But first, I just want to send a welcome on behalf of the Inclusive America Project of the Aspen Institute. The Inclusive America Project has been engaged since 2012 in trying to advance the role of religious pluralism and diversity in American public life and to advance the common good. And this conversation is an outgrowth of the work that's been happening in the Inclusive America Project around a conversation that we think is very important around racial justice. I'm very thankful to our director, Zenit Rahman, who has been leading this wonderful project, and as it seeks to try to be relevant and make a case for why it is that religious diversity is a good thing for how it is that we create good in society. And I'm very happy to be the Religion and Racial Justice Fellow for this year, researching and thinking about the ways in which religious pluralism helps to advance the cause of racial equity and justice. My name is Billy Michael Honor. I'm an organizer and public scholar, and very, very happy to be here in conversation with you today. Thank you for joining us and thinking it not robbery to spend your afternoon, or a little bit of it that is, with us. I think it'll be time well spent. And so I want you to know that we hope this is a conversation we intend for this to be. I know that our panelists won't hold back. They'll definitely, we have some of the most truth-telling, truth-speaking, and truth working and fighting and justice seeking people here today. And I'm looking forward to being in this conversation, but we want to hear your voice as well. And so please feel free to use the chat and let us know if it's something that's resonating with you. From my tradition, we say amen or ashe. So type it in or whatever it is that, however it is you show affirmation. If there are questions that come up, I want you to put them there, comments that you want to make. Please make sure that you do that. And at a time, in just a bit, we're going to open it up for those who might have questions so that you might be able to ask them. And then finally, if there are persons you think need to be a part of this conversation, we want you to invite them. We want you to invite them and send them the link and tell them, hey, join, there's a wonderful conversation happening right now. But I want to get straight to it. We have today individuals who I think are on the cutting edge of what it means to be a person of faith and also fighting for racial equity and justice in our society. Obviously, they aren't the only ones, but they're some of the ones who are committed to this work. And today we're going to engage in this conversation as a way of launching over the next several months what IAP will be doing in terms of really pushing a public conversation and pushing a public agenda around how it is that we create a really fresh, robust, multi-faith movement around the issues that we'll discuss today. The first person I want to introduce to you is the Reverend Traci Blackmon. She is the Executive Minister of Justice and Witness for the United Church of Christ. And if you've been paying attention over the last several years to the faith movements for justice, then I'm sure you've seen her face. So we're very happy to have you with us, Reverend Blackmon.
Thank you, Billy.
We also have with us today Rabbi Sharon Brous. She is a senior rabbi of Ikar, a Jewish congregation in Los Angeles, California, in sunny Los Angeles. And so for some of us here in the Midwest and on the East Coast, it's afternoon, but it'd be morning where she is. So
That's right. That's right. Hi, everyone.
Thank you for being with us, Rabbi Sharon. We have Simran. He's a doctor, but he's very nice. He asked me not to call him doctor, so we're just gonna say Simran for these purposes. But Simran Jeet Singh is here. Very glad to have you with us, kind sir, from the Union Theological Seminary, a lecturer, and just doing all the things as a scholar and an activist, and just an important voice for our times. Glad to have you with us, sir.
Thanks, Billy. Glad to be here.
And of course, we have the Reverend Osagyefo Sekou, my dear brother, a musician, a filmmaker, a public intellectual, and an activist. And I'm very glad to have him with us, serving now as a theologian in residence for a wonderful congregation in the Northwest. And so very glad to have you with us, Rev.
Glad to be here. I'm in Seattle, and I'm trying to get to this cafe, and it's called First Hill. And First Hill will be your last one.
I hear
y'all give me a few minutes to get up these last 2 hills, and then I'll sit down and talk to you.
We got you. You try to make it. You take care of yourself. We'll pick you up. And then in a little bit, we'll be joined with Rabbi Lydia Medwin, who is the rabbi over congregational engagement and outreach for a wonderful congregation, the oldest Jewish congregation in all of Atlanta, called very simply the Temple. And Rabbi Lydia is just doing so much great work on so many fronts. And we look forward to being in conversation with her in a little bit about the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration. And so thank you to all our guests for joining us. We're going to jump right into our conversation today. We're going to begin. Reverend Blackmon, when people think about racial justice, they don't oftentimes think about this nexus of what we're talking about today in terms of multi-faith engagement. You hear about racial justice in a lot of different ways. First of all, do you agree that we don't talk enough about multi-faith engagement around the issue of racial justice? And if you do agree, why do you think that is? Why do you think this conversation we're having today is not a more common conversation, given that we live in the most multiracial, multi-religious America ever?
Thank you for that question, Billy. I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna get my last name not to start with a B, because I'm always the first one to start everything. But I'm delighted to be here with my sister Sharon, and so grateful to be here with you, Simran, and hoping that Sekou makes it up that hill. I have a couple of things to say about that. I don't think that we actually are able to advance the cause of justice, especially from a scriptural perspective, without all faiths being involved. It's not a one dimension fight. It's a fight that we share as human beings and as humankind. And the multiple angles, the multiple ways we express faith, the multiple ways that we relate to the divine, the multiple ways that we interpret our sacred text, all have a critical role in play in manifesting justice, in fleshing justice as a collective people. So I think that's very important. I think, unfortunately, at least in the United States, so often our faith has been a dividing tool instead of a uniting tool. And I think that there are many who bear responsibility for that. I am from the Christian faith, and I would say, because Christianity is dominant here, that the faith that I'm a part of has to take a lot of the responsibility for that. If we were talking in terms of skin tone, racial divisions, we would say quite boldly that white supremacy has to take the lead on some things. And theologically in the United States, Christianity has that same role as being often a dominant and suppressive and absolute faith that has been the cause of some of the divisions we face. And so, having said that, I think that we can all agree after the last 4 years that we just went through, that being divisive in this way is not the answer, and that it takes everyone at the table. And when we began to examine even the sacred texts that we perhaps don't have in common, but we have common threads in all of them, they provide, in my opinion, a pathway towards justice. Justice, not in terms that are often used in the justice movements that you see here, but justice as in what was intended by God, for us to be in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. And so I think that's the role faith has to play. Mass incarceration is a part of that, but there's also a different kind of justice that we start dealing with in that. They're connected, but they're not the same, right? And so I think that in terms of creating a world where people are in right relationship with the divine and right relationship with one another, that it is not only important, but it is essential that we begin to have more conversations across faith lines.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Simran, jump in here. Reverend Traci is laying it out in terms of this divisiveness and the sort of Christocentric, if you will, sort of American culture that we're in. I don't think you identify as Christian, and so you should have an interesting perspective, maybe different from this, but jump in here. How do you respond to the question about why we don't talk more from this viewpoint about racial justice?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And you know, I'll say, I don't identify as the same religion as Reverend Blackmon, but I agree with everything she said. And so maybe that's something interesting there for us to consider, that this vision for justice does not have to be particular to our own identities, but it can be a shared one. And that justice is something that we can all share in together. In terms of exploring your question, I mean, there are so many different ways to answer this, so many reasons why we shy away from or are unable to connect religious pluralism and racial justice together. So let me give you a few. I have 3 that I'd like to share. But before even doing that, let me share why it matters so much to me. And it is, as I've grown up in this country, and as I look around today, it seems that we are hesitant and scared to recognize that we have a limited and distorted view of what racism is in this country. And this is a major problem because it prevents us from seeing the full picture and from seeing the full picture with accuracy. So if we don't understand the problem, then how can we ever create effective solutions? So that's why this question is so critical to me and why I'm so grateful to you, Billy, and to the Aspen team for bringing it forward. And so the question becomes, why is it so hard for us to see the connection between racial justice and religious pluralism? And what do we do about that? So I'll offer three ideas that I think really obscure our vision and distort our vision. First, I'd say that we like to think that racism has nothing to do with religion. That's what we like to think, but that's not true. And we know that's not true. Historically, American racism was quite literally born out of religion. If we look at the very logic or theology that drove European colonization around the world, but particularly in America, it was theology drawing from Pope Alexander VI, whose doctrine of discovery invited Christians to discover these lands, quote unquote, discover these lands, and ensure that, and this is a direct quote, the Catholic faith and Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself. Now, we don't learn about this in schools. We don't even talk about it now. But the reality is that while some ask what religion has to do with American racism, when we attend to its conquest and colonization, we have to ask the question, is it even possible to decouple religion from American racism? So that's one. The second is we prefer to think that even if those were sins of past religious experience and practice, that they are relics of the past, that they no longer pertain to modern America. But that's not true either, right? So it's true that early Christian slaveholders used the Bible to justify the enslavement of darker skinned people. That's true. It's also true that vigilante groups terrorized Black Americans as these vigilantes rode around in white hoods with a Bible in their hands. That's true too. But even now, right, if we look at today, prominent evangelical pastors spewed racist hate against America's first Black president. We could talk endlessly about the role of religion in modern white nationalism. The point is that religion and race are intertwined in the past, in the present, And they will be in the future too, unless we're able to intervene effectively. And so we can only begin when we are willing to start seeing it. And the third point is that it's one that feels really personal to me, because this comes out of my own lived experience. We like to think of race and religion as discrete identity categories, that one has nothing to do with the other. But the reality is that so many of us in this country experience racism on the basis of our religious identities. So just take my life as an example, right? You see my turban and my beard and my brown skin. This is part of my religious identity as a Sikh, and it makes me a frequent target of racial hate. I could give you dozens of examples, hundreds of examples from my life, but you probably get it just by looking at me, the kind of stuff that comes my way. The point is that religion is racialized too. And not understanding that has prevented us and continues to prevent us from being able to see how and why religious intolerance is tied to racial justice. So to tie this all up real quickly, I think the first step that we need to take as a country to bring together racial justice and religious pluralism efforts is to clarify our vision, to see and understand their inextricable interconnections. Because once we see how they're tied together, we can't unsee that. And then our efforts and our movements can follow.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing here is this idea that we really have to wrestle with the relationship, the abiding historical relationship between religion and race, right? And we have to wrestle with that in real ways. And deal with what we can decouple and what we cannot as we move forward in the pursuit of working through this. And you raised a lot of things that I think hopefully we'll be able to get to. Rabbi Sharon, I want to bring you into this conversation. I know that one of the things that we've been wrestling with as an IAP staff is this idea of, look, the case can be made that we know, or at least we feel that we understand why it is that religious pluralism, or those who do multi-faith work, need the work of racial justice, right? It's a sense in which how can you say that you are truly engaged in that type of work and you not be concerned about it? But there's a juxtaposed question, but does the movement for racial justice actually need religious pluralism? I mean, that's something you have to ponder. Is it needful? Does with all the work that we see happen, does it need it at all? Rabbi Sharon, why do those working for racial justice need us multi-faith folks working with them?
All right, great. First of all, I'm always so happy to be with you, Billy Michael Honor. So thank you for having me, and thank you to Reverend Traci and to Dr. Simran. I'm already I'm very excited to be in this conversation, and a number of thoughts going through my head right now. First, I want to just share with you that there's a Mishnah. This is the ancient Jewish code of law codified around the year 220 CE. There's one Mishnah in particular that lands in the middle of this legal code that really is an exposition on human dignity, on what does it mean to be a human being, and which is interesting in the midst of a legal code. So I want to offer this because I think it might be an interesting framework and a helpful framework for us. It actually comes in the context of an exhortation that the rabbis say that judges need to give to someone who's about to testify in a capital case, in order to warn them that when they give witness in a capital case, a person's life might actually be on the line. And so what do? How do they make this warning? They essentially ask the question, why is it in the beginning of the Torah, in the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, that when God creates the world, God starts with only one person, Adam Harishon, or Adam, not 100 people or 1,000 people? Why start with only one? And they essentially argue that there are three innate dignities that every single human being has, created in God's own image, that we learn from the fact that God started with only one, and therefore we are all descendants from one. One of those dignities is the dignity of radical equality. The idea, the rabbis say, and again, this was the year 220 CE, so 2,000 years ago, that no person can ever say, I or my people or my family are fundamentally better than you because my ancestry is greater than yours, because in fact, we all come from the same first person. So in other words, taking the kind of great biblical mythology of the origin of human beings, and instead of asking questions like, is this really how human beings came to be? Instead saying, what's the theological value of this core narrative? And the theological value is that we are compelled to look at each other and see radical equality and infinite worth and uniqueness in every single human being. So what this mission is doing is essentially putting forward the complete and total incompatibility of religion and racism as the most core theological promise of our tradition. If you say you believe in God, and if you say you take the Bible seriously, then you cannot possibly believe that some people are fundamentally better than or worse than other people, which is a pretty astonishing and radical claim for them to be making. And it is so much at the heart of faith, at the heart of my faith. And so I'm so interested in what Simran's saying, because of course we've seen through the course of religious history how exactly the opposite has been made manifest by religious parties and individuals, one after the next, in which we see religious actors perpetrating incredible acts of violence and cruelty and oppression and degradation against people of different communities, of different faiths, and of different races once the construct of race emerged, precisely in the name of religion, when those acts themselves are what undermine the very claim that those people are religious in the first place. So I want to put that out there first for us. And then let me just add to this that my real awareness and understanding of this came to me after my 6 years of seminary on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, across the street from where Simran teaches. It came to me actually when I was a young rabbi and moved out to Los Angeles. And I was invited by a pastor friend to Christmas Mass at his church at All Saints in Pasadena, which some of you, I imagine, know. This is the great Reverend Ed Bacon, who's now back in Birmingham, Alabama, and I know a friend to many, and leading really beautiful voice in the movement. And so he invited me to Christmas Mass, which I had never been to before. And I have to be honest that as a Jew growing up in America, I never had stepped into a church because I was afraid. I was afraid of churches because there was some way in which we felt like this is where the calls for pogrom were issued. And I was scared to go into a church. But he invited me, and I was a young rabbi. And so I went into the church, and he sits us in the front row with the Jews and the Muslims sit in the front row in Ed Bacon's church. And he said, the only way to build a just society is for all of us to build it together. That Jews, Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, we all have to be in this work together. And then he went on to tell the story, and I'll finish this in just a moment. He went on to share the story, the origin story of Christianity, which I think you and I have actually even talked about before, Billy. He says that from his telling of this story was about a couple that is so poor and so cast out from society that the woman, the mother, is about to give birth. She's in labor, and not one person in that inn will make room for her to be in the bed. And so she has to give birth outside on the lawn. And that is the origin story of Christianity, he says. And all of Christian history from that point forward is trying to rectify that act of casting a person or people out. And our work is to create a just society where nobody is ever treated the way Mary and Joseph were treated that night. And as I was sitting there as a young rabbi, I realized it's such a powerful story. And it's not my story. I have a different origin story. Mine is about being enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years and then partnering with God to walk on a journey from degradation to dignity and from enslavement to liberation. Our stories are different, but as Reverend Traci said, the end goal is the same. Our communal narratives and our faith narratives are pushing us and guiding us toward the same ends, which is, what does it mean to build a just and loving society? And the fact that we have different narratives to get there only strengthens us as a multi-faith coalition working toward the same ends.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Listen, Rev Sekou, I know as I was listening to Rabbi Sharon, and I was hearing her talk about this work of pushing forward this agenda of equality as a religious value. I saw you tweet, or it may have been a tweet not long ago, that you don't trust anybody who hadn't been out in the streets, like who hadn't been out in the streets, and you meant protesting and that sort of thing. Sometimes this is the multi-faith coalition, like what Rabbi Sharon is talking about, that's out there. Sometimes it's not, right? And there's sometimes tension out there, if we be honest, between those in the community and others who are out in the streets, and sometimes people of faith or clergy who may show up. There's sometimes tension and sometimes not. It just depends on the circumstance. I want you, if you can, to sort of talk about, it gets to this question of does racial justice need religious pluralism? Like, what are some of the tensions that happen around racial justice movement work and the entry of people of faith from different perspectives?
Well, first, let me just say my deepest apologies for getting my times mixed up. I live in Seattle, Washington, and so it's a little early where I am. And then secondly, I am a big fan of your work, Brother Honor, what you've done in Georgia. And so I've been keeping track of you. I make it my duty to keep track of folks who are moving work. And so I just want to say I'm a big fan of your work. And then it's always good to spend time with my dear sister and friend, Reverend Dr. Traci Blackmon. And always wonderful to be in the presence of anyone who attends, works at lectures, passes by the greatest seminary in human history, Union Theological Seminary. So I am honored to be in conversation, and thank you, Sister Rabbi, for your comments. You know, I would want to begin with, quite honestly, Brother Honor, I'm typically not interested in conversations like this, and the only reason I'm here is because you asked me. And the reason why I'm not typically interested in them, in part because there is a communion of struggle that emerges in the street, in which many of these conversations are irrelevant, right? When they're tear gassing us in Ferguson, the police ain't asking how many times you pray a day, right? They're just tear gassing you. It's like, what is the relationship to the state who is oppressing people, and what are the ways in which people of faith are going to engage in that struggle? That is the fundamental question. And religion has no monopoly on that. My soulmate, the great Albert Camus, that atheist who was wrong on Algeria, but right on so much, when he says that the task of the artist is never side with the makers of history, but rather those who are the victims of it. That sounds like Matthew 25:35. And he said, what you've done unto the least of these, so you've done it unto me. It's akin to the Jewish notion of a tikkun olam, whether it be or even in Islam, where every beginning of every session of gathering begins with A'udhu Billah minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. I seek refuge in God from Satan, the great deceiver, in the name of God, most merciful and most kind. And so when I think about these ways in which religion has emerged in struggle, right? Where is your body at? So not simply the conversation of the sanctuary, of which I am a pastor. I've spent quite a bit of time preaching. I spent quite a bit of time in a unique congregation, Valley and Mountain. Last Sunday, a trans Buddhist preached for me. So we do it a little different where I am. So multi-ethnic and multi-racial and multi-religious theologies intrinsic to the congregation that I serve. But I want to name. I think the tensions emerge because religious leaders tend to run to the front of a charging crowd and yell charge, meaning that we tend to show up late anyway. I hear Dr. James Combs saying that to me. Religion tends to show up late. And so when I think about that, it's like, where is your body? How are you going to struggle with people? What risk are you taking? The only thing that saved me in the streets of Ferguson was the fact that I had pastored there. So in the 90s, I buried a lot of the older brothers and uncles of the young people in the street. Tef Poe used to come to my Bible studies, right? And so because I had an earned credit in the street, because I had been their pastor, I had gone and got them out of jail. I had been to Little League games and football games. And so the great William Sloane Coffin once told me that the pastoral authorizes the prophetic. So what are the ways in which we're showing up in communities and that people take us seriously? The tensions only arise when clergy think they exist on the outside and the edges of a community suffering. And then what are the ways in which a community knows you, right? How are you in relationship with the people who are encountering the most hell? And are you willing to take that same kind of abuse that people are not prophesied? And then lastly, I think the relationship we need to have is given the fact that the vast majority of the money that goes into faith-based organizing is what is his relationship to the state. So whether it's on the right-wing side, is how you buttressing, elevating, lifting up right-wing talking points that emerge out of a racist identity and racial logic that is in kind of a religious garb, or is it in supporting the Democratic Party, right? What are the ways in which we're going to be in proximity to the White House? What ways are we going to be in proximity to Netanyahu, for that matter, right? Or right. So what is? I think the tension for me arises: what is our relationship to the state, and do we defend the poor over and against the state? Do we defend the vulnerable over and against the state, right? And so I'm going to defend Palestinian right to existence, put my body on the line for them. In this like manner, I'm going to defend against forms of anti-Semitism, right? I'm gonna defend queer folk catching hell inside of Black churches, right? And then I'm gonna critique white gay brothers who don't have an understanding of the trans kids that that Reverend Dr. Blackmon and I know from the streets of Ferguson, right? And so the question is, who is catching hell? And how you gonna stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable? And to me, that begins our conversation about the possibilities of what kind of struggle we're going to engage in terms of multi-religious identities.
Yeah, thank you. Who is catching hell? And how do you identify with the struggles? Thank you, Rev, for laying that out there and creating the tension in this conversation. I want to say before we shift to this other part that if those of you who are participants here, please, this is the time now, please, to put your questions in the chat. If there are things that that are coming up for you, we want you to put them there so that we can have them, because even if we don't get a chance to address all of your questions here, we're going to take each question very seriously in our ongoing research. This is something that we're thinking about deeply, much further beyond just this conversation. And so if you're out there and you have questions that arise or things that you want to say, please put them in the chat so that we can address them. But I want to go here. We're going to go this round robin, and keep in mind that as we move to this part, if you keep your answers concise so that everybody have an opportunity to get in here and respond to these as we go around. But I think Rev Sekou gave a good way for us to enter into this conversation around, okay, so the tension really is that these conversations that we're having, and I do recognize that we're having this conversation on a Thursday afternoon, when a lot of people who are concerned about the work of racial justice want to get involved in, have to work, don't have the privilege necessarily to participate in conversations like this. And he's making this case about these conversations being disconnected sometimes from some of the other type. But on the other hand, I think there is a case to be made, though, for the history of the racial justice movement in this country being deeply rooted in many ways that aren't always highlighted, though, in faith traditions, right? That bring to bear, as as Rabbi Brous was talking about, all of the theological resources and sometimes the people resources. So it's not as though the two have been neatly separated, right? There's always been a sort of connection there. But there is that tension that I do want to recognize. And so when we think about in this current moment, with all of the racial justice issues that we face, right? Taking into account the things that we've heard, in this very moment, if there is a particular racial justice issue, if you were to say that if we could do the things that we've been talking about in terms of building a coalition, what issue that you would highlight that says this issue, this racial justice issue, desperately needs multi-faith coalition? Whatever that issue may be, we're going to have a conversation in a little bit about mass incarceration, but there are lots of issues that intersect in terms of racial justice issues where you say, this is the issue, I think. And so I want to give everybody an opportunity to say very concisely what you think. Where do we need more multi-faith racial justice coalitions? And Simran, go ahead, jump in here, and then Reverend Blackmon and Reverend Sharon.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, as a resident nerd and scholar here, I would sort of pull back on the question a little bit and sort of lean into a little bit of what we've been hearing so far from folks, which is it's not really about a single issue. And yes, absolutely, we should talk about specific issues, but I think the challenge for us right now is we're living in a society in which there are inequities across the board on the basis of different identity groups, and religion is one of them. Race is another one of them, and sometimes those two come together to really marginalize certain groups. And so what do we do about that as we're thinking about these particular issues as they manifest themselves? How do we actually make space? I think that's the question that we're trying to explore here. And one of the answers that I've been hearing sort of echoing as I've heard other folks speaking is that there is this experience for those of us who are religious minorities in this country of constantly operating through the frame of the dominant tradition. Right. And so here is where an analog through the racial justice movement becomes helpful, because right now we have a lot of helpful, interesting conversations around whiteness and white supremacy. And if we can better understand what those things are, and I think we are, if we can understand their histories and how they operate in our society, in our institutions, in our policies, then we can start actually addressing them. And so this is the nerd side of me saying, like, hold on a second, let's step back and see what's working, like where are we making progress, and then how do we then start applying that into the religious pluralism efforts, the multi-faith movement. And so one of the things I've been seeing around this sort of stripping down of white supremacy is the opening up of space for different marginalized groups to begin having equal access. And it's a beginning, right? We're not close to there yet, but the conversation is really shifting. And so what would that look like in the religion frame? I think one of the things that we could do is, as we see how these conversations are shifting, is to start exploring how dominant religious groups, right, in America, in the American context, that's Christianity, how they have been deemed normative, therefore given advantage in the way that whiteness has. You know, even the word religion, the model of religion is based on a Christian lens, based on Christian conceptions of how religion, quote unquote, ought to operate. So the point is, and I'll sort of pause here and pass it along, the point is that while these efforts may have been well-intended, right, not necessarily malicious, sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And although the very many in the normative group may perceive these inequities to be relatively harmless, those of us on the margins know from our life experiences, from our daily lives, that the impact for us is to be decentered, to be excluded, and ultimately to be left on the margins, right? To not have any opportunity for progress. And that is where I see, you know, the movement for racial justice really giving us good insight into what it would look like to create a positive change, to revisit our structures, to understand how they might be producing inequities, and then reimagining in the way that Rabbi Brous was just doing so beautifully for us, reimagining what a different kind of life would look like for us as a collective. I think that's the kind of move that I think the religious pluralism, multi-faith movement has to make now.
Yeah. Thank you. Reverend Blackmon, respond to anything, my question, or anything you want around this. Yeah.
I'm going to respond to your question because I actually like it. I'm not going to answer it in the issues that you might be expecting. I do think there's a singular issue, and even in Simran's response, I saw it again. I think the issue is that we are not able to see clearly. We have an issue with seeing one another as human beings that are equal, and not, going back to what Rabbi Sharon was saying as well, seeing the value and the dignity and the worth of one another as being equal. One of the Hebrew scriptures, a scripture from Hebrews, not Hebrew scripture, that I wanted to lift up in this moment is found in Hebrew 13 and verse 3. It says, remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourself was being tortured. And that's what I hear my brother Sekou saying. Religion has always been problematic, but the movement in the streets is full of faith. It's the institutionalization of religion that is a problem. And it causes us to need to deconstruct theologies that would suggest that we have a God who prefers some over others. No matter where we're looking at it from, we have a problem of fully seeing one another as human beings eye to eye in equitable situations. And if I can see you fully, then I can identify with what you're going through. And what I see people in the movement rejecting is this notion that you can come in and not fully see them and dismiss them as though you should be the leader, right? They're not having it. And they shouldn't have it. And we shouldn't be having it anywhere. And so I long for a time when across faiths, we could put aside our religiosity and see one another as human beings and use our sacred texts and our experiences and yes, our traditions to elevate that conversation that includes everyone. I see that in the States and I see it outside of the States. I see it intergenerationally. I see it interdenominationally. I see it all in one congregation where the elders think that the young people don't have anything to say. It's everywhere that we do not value on an equitable field the presence of humankind. And for me, that is the issue. That's the issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. As you were talking, I was thinking about Dr. Eddie Glaub's book. It's in Begin Again, but it's also in Democracy in Black. We talks about the real issue of racial justice in this country is around the value gap, right? And the value gap is the faulty myth that's a part of the American thinking that white lives matter more than other lives, you know, of valuing white lives more, and that essentially that value gap of putting more value on white lives than any other lives, whatever those lives are at the heart of why it is we have to rethink in many ways what has been the American project. And so I hear you beckon this idea of dignity and equality, and it is bigger than simply just you know, racialized terms. And I hear that in so many ways.
I want to say though, Billy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's not leave it with whiteness and blackness. I'm suggesting that we take that same model and we do it in religion. I'm suggesting that we think that because people in the street largely may not be yelling from the rooftops that they're associated with some religion, and many of them are not associated with any institutional religion, then we make the decision that that means somehow they're not connected to God. I would suggest that oftentimes we are the ones who need to go out and receive the Spirit, right? Versus those who are in the streets, we are deeming as in need of us. And that's what I hear Sekou saying much better than I can say it. But it's not just that whiteness matters more, it's whatever we are matters more.
Yeah, no, that's
embodiment of white supremacy in every other area. It's whatever we are that, you know, straightness matters more. Christian matters more.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there, you know. But
no, we follow. Yeah, no, we got you. No, thank you. Yeah, I think we're getting, Rabbi Sharon, I'm coming to you and Rev Sekou. I think what we're getting at and what keeps coming up is it seems as though before we can get to this real conversation about you know, motivated movements around race, just there's a lot of work to be done internally about our religious viewpoints and the way in which people of faith show up in the world, right? The way in which religion shows up, and that we can place value on people by their, you know, our perception of their connection to divine or not. And so I hear that. Rabbi Sharon, I mean, you know, I know you won't mind this being brought up because Sekou alluded to it. And I know you've been making statements about this in the press recently around what's happening in the Israel and Palestinian circumstance and situation. I bring that up only to say that in a real sense, right? And Reverend Blackmon just alluded to it, that part of what also needs to happen in this conversation is that we not talk about it just in terms of white and black, right? That when we talk about racism, that there are many other ways in which we can talk about. That's why in the work we've been doing, we've all been talking about racism in its various forms. I mean, there are conversations we can have about cultural imperialism. There are conversations we can have about various different forms of settler colonialism and other things like that. But for you and from your viewpoint, right, what is the issue that's important? But also speak a bit about, as a Jewish person in this particular moment that we sit right now, how are you thinking about it in relationship to conversations around Zionism and other things along those lines?
Yeah, I do think that we are that our era is an era of great moral awakening. I think what we've witnessed over the last year and really the last 5 years is that a lot of what's been voiced from the margins for decades is now moving to the mainstream. And so you're reading about and hearing about and seeing in mainstream newspapers things that were only talked about, that were talked about from the sidelines before. And the conversation has absolutely changed. I think that I think we have to acknowledge that there's been a kind of unveiling, that after the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the conversation around policing in America moved into the mainstream, and there were lots of white people who were talking about and thinking about and engaging in this question and in these kind of root causes and of the injustice in the country in ways that simply they never were before. So, and I think that historians will write about why the year 2020 was the year that so much opened up and what it means, the kind of convergence of coronavirus and that existential vulnerability and isolation and uncertainty after 4 years of Trump, after watching what happened in our country, why that created the fertile ground for a great moral awakening. I believe that it is not only not possible, but it would be irresponsible to experience that moral awakening here and not also apply that to the lens through which we engage all of the conflicts and dynamics in the world, including the Israel-Palestine conflict, which many of us have been in for many, many years. And I think that what's really critical here is, and so I'm gonna add a layer, because what I heard from you, quoting Eddie Glaude, is there's this values gap. What I hear from Reverend Traci is there's an empathy gap, and what I hear from Dr. Simran is that there's an imagination deficit. And so, like, between the values, the empathy, and the imagination that's missing, I think we also have a desperate need for truth telling, to create the space and to create the opportunities for us to simply be honest about where we come from and where we're going and where the pain is. And so I think you were with me at Ebenezer before the midterm election. I think we were there together that night. And I shared this story of a friend of mine who went into the ER because she had a horrible abdominal pain. And when they looked at her, the doctors discovered that she had a cancer wrapped around her spine. And they were able to save her life because they were able to diagnose the illness, and it had nothing to do with the abdominal pain. And what I was saying then, and what I believe now to be absolutely the case, is that we have to be willing to take an honest look at where the broken parts are, and if we treat cancer like it's a skin wound, then we're going to die. And so when we look at this country, and I believe, and I say this as a rabbi and a Jewish leader, when we look at Israel-Palestine, if we refuse to honestly analyze and assess and determine what is going on here, what are the root causes of this conflict, if we fail to be honest with ourselves and with each other about what's actually going on, there's no way that we will be able to remedy and to begin to heal. Truth telling is absolutely essential for any healing to be possible. That truth telling has to come with some very real awareness. I'll talk specifically about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is because of the history of anti-Semitism and the way that anti-Semitism is operationalized and in various societies, including in our society here in America. And because of the way that anti-Semitism is so often uninterrogated and then it emerges through acts of violence against the Jewish community, there's an incredible defensiveness around actually engaging in this kind of truth telling, because there is a fear that many people hold that it's not going to be a fair analysis. And so I think a lot about the trauma that's at the heart of both Israeli and Palestinian narratives, and the ways that we can and we must engage in this act of truth telling by listening to the actual people whose lives are on the line, by recognizing and understanding the power dynamics, by looking at the history, which is not a simple cut and dry history. And I think a lot of the mapping that happens where we try to map other conflicts onto this conflict fail because they fail to recognize the unique circumstances of this conflict. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a power analysis here. And that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be very strong criticism. What it means is that we are called in this era of moral awakening to apply the standard of a just and equitable society here in the United States, in Israel and Palestine, and really all around the world. And as we strive to do that, we're going to have to look at the empathy gap, at the values gap, at the imagination gap, and we're going to have to look at the gap in truth telling. And to do so very, very thoughtfully and very carefully, because ultimately, I will say this about there, and the same way we say this about what we're struggling with here. Nobody's going anywhere. There are, in fact, 9 million citizens of Israel most of whom don't have passports to any other country. There are 5 million more Palestinians who are living under Israeli occupation. Nobody's leaving. So what we have to figure out is, how are we going to build a just society there that actually recognizes and honors the dignity of every single person? And in order to do that, it's going to require a lot of kind of wrestling engagement in order to ultimately manifest that dream. And there I look to the Israelis and Palestinians who are on the ground, tens of thousands of whom are marching together arm in arm throughout this most recent escalation, really insisting that there is a way to build a better future. The same way that I look to the people who joined in the streets in the racial justice uprisings here, in order to say together we can and we must build a true multiracial democracy that's just and equitable and fair for everyone.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, there's a lot there that we have to wrestle with. As we come to the end of this part of this conversation, before we transition, we're Rabbi Lydia and our conversation. It's important for us to, and when I say us, I mean IAP, to engage in this with people like yourselves, because part of what we want to do this year is to really engage and go deep into this question, and to go deep into many of the things that you put on the table. And this is the start of this conversation. The goal of this wasn't to try to solve anything. We're not naive in that. It was to begin the conversation, to actually see what the questions are, to see what the issues are that we need to be considering this year as we deal with this. And you've definitely helped us to do that. And I'm thankful for each of you. And to that point, what we'll be doing is, there's a commission that will be formed, that is forming, made up of moral leaders and scholars and activists who will be coming together throughout the remainder of this year, thinking about what an agenda around multi-faith racial justice and engagement looks like. And how do we form that, and how do we begin to push that and make it available to those who are already doing a lot of this work on the grounds. And so as a final piece here, and I'll start with Rev Sekou, and then we'll go around, and can we keep this as concise as possible to a minute or so. If you had advice to us, who this commission that's getting formed, about what's important in this work, if there is a group really genuinely, and there are people, we have participants here who've been watching and listening to us talk here. There are lots of people who I imagine came onto this because they're really interested in how it is they connect their faith to someone else's faith, and trying to get involved and make that meaningful and creating a more equitable and just racial world. How can we do that, though? To speak to somebody, a citizen, maybe not a faith leader, who really just wants to get involved in the work. What would you tell them as a way of instruction of how we get going? Rev, the floor is yours.
Well, I would begin with, I'm thinking about when I was in Palestine. I was there about 15 minutes. And I kind of looked around, and I saw how my body responded to Israeli police, just seeing them. And I just looked around. I said, oh, y'all done got it. where do you party at? Because I know you can't live under this kind of oppression and not party. And I partied in Palestine, right? So the question for me is a lot less about what the gathering of the commission is and that kind of thing. But what local areas is an anti-evangelical model. I'm not asking God to come do anything. I just want to be where he's already working, right? So what are the ways in which, so what I would say to the Aspen Institute with all that money y'all got, find out who catching hell, who doing interfaith organizing, slide some bread over there and then go on over there and see about them every night, right? In terms of, because Dr. Blackmon and I have been on a million of these commissions. We have talked and said and been in the meetings about folk catching hell when we can, at the same time, our phones are blowing up in these meetings because of the people we love and pastor in the streets are catching hell. So the question for me is that where are people catching hell and how you showing up, right? So if you want to go to Rochester, New York, there's an interfaith group there struggling there. If you're thinking about the prison industrial complex, there's an old black lady who's been organizing against prison work in Chicago, and among them were Ahmadiyya Muslims as well as Sunni and Shiite Muslims. If you want some interfaith work going over there in the Philly, where they got one of the oldest black Shiite communities in the United States, right? If you don't win in Georgia against all that money without an interfaith coalition. So the question is not whether every movement I've been in has been interfaith. Whether it been the war on the precious people of Iraq, right? Where we had Japanese Buddhists who sang "Go Down Moses," right? So the issue is, so it's not in the question of whether or not interfaith work is happening. It is whether or not those of us who are in the professional managerial class are in proximity to struggle. Those of us who get paid to teach, write books, and lecture, and be and work inside the denominations, which I'm guilty of. I ain't casting disparage. I wouldn't be able to eat if it wasn't for liberal white folks giving me money to talk to them about black struggle. So I'm not going after that, but I also understand my positionality. What are the ways in which we are in proximity to the suffering of everyday people? So in Queens, brother Singh, what little Sikh kid is catching hell? And can you show up for him, right? And so to me, that becomes that. To me, if like a rabbi laid it out in terms of these various gaps, I think the gap, one of the other gaps is that how are your feet on the ground in the midst of struggle in uncomfortable situations, right? Where you are not the sinner, where you're not the my street cred is precarious, yeah, right? Because it's predicated on how often I show up. And so for me, I think the real question for it is who is catching hell and how are you showing up, right? And then the other question for it is that will you open your mosque or your synagogue when young people running from the police and protesting and not let the police in? Yeah. That's a real basic question to me, right? Like, so even if you don't understand, like I'm gonna tell you the truth, 95% of that shit they did in the streets of Ferguson, I thought was dumb. And I told them as much. Yeah. At my dinner table. On television, I lied. This is the greatest generation we've ever seen. We've been waiting on them. They have the deep moral and ethical tradition that we've been waiting on, and out of their bellies shall be birthed the redemption of America. Right? I feel you. Because what I'm just saying is show up. Yeah, no, I'm with you. No, that's all good. And I thank you for that word. And I want to pass it on to you, Reverend Blackmon. I think that's a good entree. You were in the streets of Ferguson. What do you say to this question? What would you tell us?
Well, I think one of the things that Sekou just said that really resonates with me, and is what I was trying to say about religion versus faith, is that the movement in the streets has always been interfaith, right? It's been those who care who show up, and they don't show up. Most of the time, they don't show up representing their denomination. Most of the time, they show up against the denomination because they care about what's happening in the streets. And so we already have that piece going on. And whether you say it in terms of gaps, like Sharon says it, or you say it in terms of who's catching hell, like Sekou says it, or you say it in terms of pointing to the nerdiness of having to deal with multiple issues and saying it's not just one issue, as Simran says it. I think we're all saying that you have to see one another. You have to see one another and value that sight as much as you value seeing yourself. Not that we're all going to be the same, but that we're able to see those differences. It is difficult in this moment. I am really struggling. It is difficult as a Black person who has spent time in Palestine to not just cry all the time, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that Jewish people that I have deep relationships with, who I include Sharon as being one of them, is not to say I don't see that fear and that pain, right? That's one place. Here in America, it is difficult to be Black and not feel this pain. And so until we can see one another and hear one another, we're not going to get far. And I don't believe that's going to happen in any room or in any building. It's going to happen in the streets. It's just, we've tried meeting and gathering around tables. We've been at tables from the White House to every denomination. It's got to happen where the Spirit is moving, and the Spirit is moving in the streets.
Amen. Well, listen, this has been a rich conversation. I certainly, I'm taking away a lot here. And part of what I know as an organizer and knowing each of you is the heart that you bring to this work. And I'm really happy, really thankful for you to be in conversation with us. This is too big.
Question, Billy?
Yes, of course. Go ahead. Yes, really quickly.
It is a quick question.
Yeah.
I came to Georgia on an invitation to be with you. That's where I met you. And and to do some organizing under your direction.
Yes.
And you never asked me about my religion.
That's true. Yeah.
You never asked me.
Yeah.
You just wanted me to show up, right?
That's right.
You didn't ask me. I mean, movement work is also a religion, right?
That's right.
And you just wanted us to show up.
That's it. No,
did you ask other people what their faith was?
No, I did not. And I think, thank you, Pastor Traci, for making that point, because I think it's a good segue to the next conversation we're going to have. And I definitely going to have to move on to have this conversation with Rabbi Lydia, because she gets to the heart of a lot of what's being laid on the ground in terms of, are you identifying with the suffering that's actually happening? And that's at the heart of that conversation we're about to have. But this is to be continued. I want to say to Simran, to Rabbi Sharon, to Reverend Traci, and to Reverend Sekou, I thank you so much for taking time to be a part of this. And we're going to be seeking your guidance in different ways in terms of how it is we really engage this work. But thank you to each of you. We have questions that came in the chat that we didn't have time to get to. A lot of them had to do around Islamophobia and what is the faith, the voice that comes from Islam on these questions. And we'll be having more conversations, but we'll get a chance to dive into that. We did invite Omar Salemi to be a part of this conversation, and others. He had other things to do, but we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to be able to address those questions as well as many others. And so if you're a participant here, know we're going to get to those questions and we're going to answer them. But thank you to my guests here. I love y'all, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I want you all to help me welcome Rabbi Lydia Medwin into the floor here. She's going to help us to end our conversation. How you doing, my Rabbi?
Hey, Reverend Billy.
Hey, good to see you. Listen, the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration. Tell us what's been happening. What is the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration? What is it? Tell us about it.
I'm so excited to be able to share this, especially in this very esteemed company. Thank you so much for your incredible comments and conversations. I'm deeply moved and motivated by your work. The multi-faith initiative to end mass incarceration was started by then Reverend, now Senator Raphael Warnock. He reached out to Auburn Seminary, where he is a fellow, and said, I really need a conference on ending mass incarceration from a faith voice. And very quickly after that, I think Reverend Billy, you were part of this conversation. The decision was made that this is not just a conference, this really is a movement. And since that time, one of their first calls was to the temple because they knew that this had to be a multi-faith initiative. And that experience led to me getting involved, later Odyssey Impact documentary, filmmaker to get involved. And very quickly we found that there was a deep need, a deep desire on the part of so many faith communities to have a very clear moral voice about what it was to deal with mass incarceration in our congregations, as a society, in our communities, as a country. We decided on 3 main strategies to attack this question. One is congregational engagement. How can each individual mosque, synagogue, church, temple get involved in this work so that our people get a real sense of the story, the truth telling that Rabbi Sharon was talking about? How do we get those stories out and into the public sphere? How can congregations that are so credible in terms of service, how can we really sort of nudge them towards what we like to call just service, which is this notion that that service is actually connected to a larger story of oppression and a larger story of narrative change, which is a second pillar. We started thinking about how do we tell this story differently? What's the different kind of theology we want to bring to bear on this? We heard from Dr. Simran about some of that history. I'd include in that, there was a whole, I mean, this blew my mind. Probably everyone else already knew this, but there was a slave Bible, Billy. I did not grow up knowing that in Memphis, Tennessee in the 80s, okay? And it took out all the parts about liberation that is so core to my own theology, like to what I know that book to be all about. So we're redeeming not just our religions, but obviously also the conversation about what it means to be a redeemed person through our narrative change. And then most importantly, policy change. How do we make this transformative work policy level?
Yeah, no, thank you for that overview. I mean, it's just really phenomenal work. I hope you'll take time to, if you're out there, that you'll look it up and see the work that's being done. The reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because I figured that what happened in our previous conversation would happen, knowing a bit about how this works, in the sense that I think some of us who are involved in doing the work of organizing people, bringing people together, create social change, we want to organize people around just saying, hey, look, if you're a person of goodwill, you come out, get involved in this. And we already know that starting out around an identity sort of criteria sometimes is the wrong way to go, right? That this becomes about, look, are you really trying to do something about the issue or not? But at the same time, there are movements like the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration that very overtly say, look, we are about bringing a multi-faith coalition together to try to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated, because we believe that, religious movements may be forces by themselves, but they become even greater movements when we work together with other traditions. And so from your perspective, how is this multi-faith coalition work? Like why is it more beneficial than just if you and some of your rabbi colleagues, or if some of the imams who are part of just some of why is it important that we're doing this together?
I mean, the most powerful asset I think that we bring as a multi-faith movement is power, right? There's power in numbers. We all know this as an organizer, right? Change happens through power in numbers and power in resources. And power in unified voice, and the way that translates in media, right? And so I think with multi-faith voices in the room, our voices are that much more powerful. We get to live into and be the change we want to see in the world, right? By modeling what it looks like to offer forgiveness and redemption and breaking down biases and allowing especially my white colleagues to investigate some tough questions about white supremacy. I think leaning into our differences and our commonalities makes for great spiritual work. That's what part of the benefits are of doing this together. But truly, I think we get a chance to understand, as some of our speakers were already saying, that the actual bodies of actual people, their basic dignities, our human dignities, are being ripped away. again and again through mass incarceration and all of the various forms that it takes. And if we as faith, how can we call ourselves people of faith if we see that as truth and we don't respond? And so I think it allows us to live into our faiths.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love it. Yeah, we got a couple minutes here before we've reached the end of our time. And so I want to ask you this final question for you in terms of this, mass incarceration is one issue, right? Like that's one issue. It intersects with racial justice in many ways, right? What are the resources, like practically speaking, what has this multi-faith coalition of people come together and say, these are the type of things we're actually doing? Like you talked about the mission of it, but practically, what are some of the things that's actually being done if somebody wants to think about what their multi-faith coalition, wherever they are, could do? And then we'll close our time. What's happening? What you doing?
Great. So I'll start on the synagogue or church or mosque level, that singular community level. Places of faith are getting into record restriction summits to help restrict records for folks that have them, bailout days to raise funds to get people who are being held because of wealth-based detention out of jails. We're working on networking the networks. So in 6 different regions across America, we're helping people that have a heart for this work to find one another, to amplify their work, to invite in other voices and other congregations into that work. And then from a national level, we're partnering with all the major denominations and sort of unusual suspects. What does it look like to have the music industry in this conversation, or the NFL Players Coalition, former and current NFL players involved in this conversation, so that we're coordinating these messages, then the message deliverers on a national scale to try to really lift up this humanitarian crisis that is going on in our country.
Yeah.
Oh, Rabbi Billy, you muted. Rabbi, I just called you Rabbi.
Thank you. I take it. You my Reverend. We switched. But listen, I hope you'll look at the work of the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration. It's a really great model for the way in which we can engage in this work and really create change around policy issues, but as well as material ways in which people's lives are made better. And so thank you, Rabbi Lydia, for all the work you're doing. This is until next conversation for us. And so I really appreciate you, and thank you for being with us. Thank you to all our participants for coming on and being a part and listening to this conversation with our speakers. You could tell they were fired up and have a lot to say on this. And so we're going to take the questions that you dropped, and we're going to respond, and we're going to have another conversation and make sure that we're able to continue this and address all the things that we weren't able to cover here. It's a big subject. It's a lot going on. It's a lot to tackle, but we're up for the challenge. And I thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you to all of our panelists and guests, and for the wonderful IAP team for helping us to do this. And so till next time, we'll see you. You have a great day.